What's up, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Upon Further Review. I'm Mike here with Troy, and today our topic of discussion is this romanticizing of these Confederate monuments, statues, and all the glorification of past that people really don't understand, and kind of leading into why it's appropriate for a lot of these things to be removed. Um, I'm gonna start right off the bat with a lot of people do not know or understand the history of the Confederacy. Many people just are totally misinformed, and a lot of that was by design. People don't understand things that actually originated from Confederacy. For instance, like Memorial Day. Memorial Day used to be called Confederate Decoration Day, where they would place little flags on the tombs of soldiers that passed there, right? And also a lot of people were running around waving that, proud rebel flag as they put it on their trucks and wear shirts and drape themselves in the flags like they're Batman or something. They don't even understand that that's actually not the Confederate flag, right? That is the Confederate Jack. The Confederate flag was a totally different design, totally looked different. So we're starting to see, and the reason I bring these up is the misunderstanding of the Confederacy as a whole, right? And this was all by design. This was all part of, if you may have heard people reference this, it's called the Lost Cause Movement, okay? And this Lost Cause Movement is an over romanticism of the Confederacy, right? The movement loves to frame Confederates as some kind of heroes defending the Southern way of life against those overwhelming Northern forces. They tend to kind of cling and hang on to these three following tenets. The first one being the Confederate fight was a heroic fight. They love to romanticize and make their heroes like Robert E. Lee a romanticized figure, that he was some leader against Northern oppression, and he was up against the odds, and he's such a courageous man. They love to really make their whole fight seem really heroic. The second tenet is that the enslaved blacks were actually better off being slaves. They tend to argue that the blacks, if they were let go and they were allowed their freedom, they would have a poorer quality of life. They like to argue that the enslaved blacks were happy and were happy to be there on the farms. So, on the plantations, excuse me. So that's another crucial argument of the lost cause movement. And the third final cause is that the war itself was not about slavery, which we all know is a lie. We know that's a lie because in the Articles of Confederation, we see that in their Declaration of Independence, they list slavery as a primary reason. Each state, when it succeeds in its papers of succession, lists slavery as the primary reason. So we know that's a lie outright. And really, you're saying, well, okay, well, how are so many people uh, deceived, and how do so many people not know the real history of the Confederacy? And really, it's because of this lost cause movement. It's really one of the most notoriously effective movements to rewrite history, and it was almost impressive because it was done by a losing side. Right? They lost the war, but yet they were successfully able to change the narrative for so many. Right? And you're wondering, how did this happen? Who was responsible for this? It was really a conglomerate of individuals, writers, former generals, poets of that day. But to be honest, the major group that was responsible for pushing this whole lost cause movement and trying to reframe the Confederacy was a group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy, right? And this group was founded in 1894, and they have the sole goal of preserving the Confederate culture and way of life, right? These women were that made up this group were descendants from elite antebellum families. They were really well connected and well connected families. They used to do huge fundraising. They were lobbying. They had lobbying groups, and at its height, this group had over 100,000 members. So it was a really powerful group. And with all that lobbying and fundraising they did a few things. One, they erected a ton of Confederate memorials and statues. They were responsible for street namings and all the things you see with the Confederacy on it. They were one of the people chiefly responsible for fundraising the funds for that, getting the politicians on board to erect these statues. Another thing that they did that was even more devious. And this gets where we get into understanding why so many people are misinformed is they were influential in writing the textbooks and the history textbooks, and especially the part where it covered the Confederacy. And they made it so that they framed the Confederacy in such a positive light. They made sure that the Confederacy was framed by this lost cause movement, where they were really these noble underdogs fighting to keep their way of life, which was a noble way of life. And they put this stuff in textbooks. Matter of fact, textbooks or any books that were found that didn't have this framing of the Confederacy, they made it so laws and policies were passed that those books had to be rounded up and stamped as anti-Confederate and destroyed. Up right. This it sounds like something that you would see in Nazi Germany, but this has actually happened in the United States. And to understand how bad of a problem this was, these books were still into circulation up until the 1970s, right? So now you're starting to see when you see these guys and gals on the news, and you're like, how in the world are they so misinformed? They were taught it in schools. Their parents taught them that. That's all they were taught. That's what they knew. They were taught that this is the truth. You guys are on the right side of history, and the whole Civil War was about just Southern pride and retaining the rights to live and rights to be happy in pursuit of happiness. That's what they were taught, right? And now you start seeing how so many people could be so upset about these Confederate statues being brought down. Just another quick thing to highlight: these United Dogs of the Confederacy. Another thing they did was they founded the Children of Confederacy, and essentially that's like Boy Scouts for Racists, where they were taught to memorize Confederate poems and generals' names and all these details of the battle, but all of these skewed to glorify the Confederacy. So now you're having children brought up with this, and you're looking at them, and they raise, of course, they grow up and they raise their children what they learn, and by virtue, you see it passed down the line. It's a dissertation of history. And this whole lost cause movement is just runs rampant all the way that the Daughters of the Confederacy were responsible for influencing President Woodrow Wilson, who was also a notorious racist. While he was the principal at while he was writing papers, he once wrote that the Ku Klux Klan saved the South and that he glorified them. He was also responsible for really pushing and promoting and helped make the Birth of a Nation. And everybody knows the Birth of a Nation is that film that really tried to frame the South in a totally different light and the Confederacy and how great the Ku Klux Klan was. And he was responsible for pushing that. He even had viewings and showings at the White House for the public to see. He wanted that to be the message that set. And even that the Daughters of the Confederacy even successfully lobbied him to have him put a Confederate statue memorial in Arlington National Cemetery. So you see the power of this group. They have power to reach presidents and kind of bend them to the will to push this Confederate narrative. And now that we kind of understand this, we start to see why so many of these white people that come out and they're just so pro-Confederacy because they've been misinformed their entire life. And a lot of it's born out of ignorance. This is the way they were taught, and they refuse to open their eyes to what the actual truth is. It's been so ingrained in part of their DNA that to abolish the Confederacy is to abolish a part of themselves, right? And to really shed light on the horrendous horrors of what it was.
Especially when you keep in mind that in the South, those Confederate states had lots of very, very wealthy and well-connected families. They were economic power due to the free slave labor. And instantly after the loss of this war, they no longer had access to that free labor. So you have these well-to-do families and these things that they were fought for, and their brothers and cousins and uncles and nephews and what have you that went out and fought this war. No one wants to look back at them as heinous, as evil, as negative. No, they did not want to look back on this moment as a stain on history, as it should have been reflected. More critically for the Union, they just wanted to make the country whole again. They wanted to teach and spread unity. They did not want to rub the losers in face in the dirt, punish them, and impose devastating payments on. In fact, they even had reparations for the slave owners who lost their slaves. They were paid roughly $300 per slave head, which would be roughly about the equivalent of about $9,000 in today's money per slave that they owned. So those who had the biggest plantations got paid the most money directly out of the pocket of the federal government. Keep that in mind when we have our reparations conversation eventually. But they wanted to welcome them back as equals. The veterans that survived the Civil War looked at each other and they saluted each other for their bravery and they fought valiantly. And over time, as you so eloquently put it, we evolved from the getting away from the actual causes of this war was fought for to pure romanticization. And as those daughters of the Confederate Revolution, or I might have mispronounced that, the daughters of the Confederacy, as they push and get these monuments erected, keep in mind they built a few. The majority of Confederate monuments spiked in two times. John Oliver did an excellent piece on this show. And the first one was around the rise of Jim Crow laws. Massive, massive spike all throughout the South of putting up these Confederate monuments is a clear symbol, an obvious symbol. And the second was during the Civil Rights era, a massive spike of putting up Confederate monuments. They romanticized it and they whitewashed that history and they teach it as to the most egregious, just a friendly North-South rivalry. We forget the Confederacy shot first. We were one nation, and South Carolina opened fire at Fort Sumter on a Union-held fort there. They started the war and they lost the war. And their sole cause of that war was the election of Abraham Lincoln and the fear that they were going to have at the federal level slavery stripped from them. So yeah, they could say states' rights. States' rights to do what? The states' rights to own slaves. Slavery was the number one revolving issue. It was about white supremacy. It is out the words of Jefferson Davis himself and written in those Articles of Confederation, as you touched on. That is what these monuments are about. Now, when we come to today's day and age, the question is, what do we build a statue for? Why should a monument stand? People say we will lose history. We don't lose history if we teach the history correctly in our schools. We don't teach history correctly. We teach a rose-colored glasses version of history. We don't teach just how horrible and how ugly history really is. And when you do that, you build the misconceptions. That's how you get all the way up to the point where Confederate flag is seen for many as this Southern heritage symbol with no connection to the horrific reality of white supremacy and slavery. And it's insanity. It's almost a marketing ploy. Good old Dixie. You see Dixie referred to in songs. The Dixie Chicks are now changing their names. Lady Antebellum's changing their name as if you don't realize what these things are attached to. People get married on plantations, which is the equivalent of getting married at Auschwitz because the landscape is beautiful. That's a horrific reality. There's nothing nice, nothing kind, nothing gentle about the institution of slavery, and especially in those deep South Confederate states. That's where the term getting sold down the river comes from. If you were in the northernmost territory and you had slaves and your slaves tried to run away or rebel or fight back, they would sell you down the Mississippi River to the deep South, where it was even more heinous, where they were torturing people, they were castrating men. They would take a man, cut his balls off, and rape him right in front of everybody else, and then murder him in front of his family, in front of his children, slaves. This is what they did. Because if you let people choose between being shot or serving in servitude for all their life, for their children, everyone else, people just might choose to be shot. So they use brutality, torture, horrific murder. They set people on fire. They cut people in half. They put people in horrific shackles. They rape the women. And then the children that were born from that those are just free slaves that come in for the extra buck after they have their fun. The institution of American slavery, especially as it was brought to a close and the North eliminated slaves, because a lot of people, I've had people bring that up. The North had slaves at a point in history, but every last one of those states phased them out. It was the South and the Confederacy that fought to keep it through 1864, obviously, and they lost their battle to keep it. Why do we memorialize anyone? We memorialize people who did something noteworthy in the history of the country in a positive light. We don't stack up statues of mass shooters. We don't have statues to, the 9/11 terrorists. We don't have statues to any other traitor in history, but these people, these Confederate generals, leaders, and presidents who conspired to commit violence and create the bloodiest conflict in the history of this nation over the issue of white supremacy and slavery do not deserve statues. They should never have. They never will. They can have a monument in their Confederate cemetery where they're all buried, leave it there. They can have exhibits to them in museums. And when we teach the history, teach the real history of what these men were fighting for. It was not honorable. And nobody wants to admit that their grandparents, their great grandparents at this point, great uncles, great what have you, their family fought for that level of evil and barbarity. They fought for their family farm. They fought for their family state. But fought to do what is the key. We can say the same thing of the Nazis in Germany. They were fighting for their country. They were fighting for honor. They were fighting for the patriotism. They fought because, their family fought to protect their farmlands. And no, they were Nazis fighting for the goals and aims of their Nazi leader, Adolf Hitler. Their individual motivations are irrelevant when that is the force they're fighting for, and that's who they wanted to win, and they were committing war crimes and atrocities along the way. The reality is we need to shine a full-blown light on the Confederacy by teaching real history, what it's about, what they did, and what they wanted to keep doing.
Important to point out how alarming and prevalent the naming of streets and the naming of schools and the amount of monuments that are out there in the United States today. Currently, there are roughly 1,448 streets named after Confederate figures. There are 185 schools in 17 states named after people with ties to the Confederacy. The Southern Poverty Law Center estimates that there's about 1,500 Confederate memorials in the United States today. There's about 718 of those memorials are statues, and about 10 U.S. military bases. Mind you, the Confederacy, they were traitors. They were traitors to the United States. And we have 10 military bases named after them. How asinine is that, right? These people fought for the preservation of slavery, and the amount of misunderstanding that is through the roof. A poll was done about how much the Civil War, what people thought of it. And in the poll, only 48% of people thought that the Civil War was primarily about states' rights. Yes, partly it was the states' rights to have slaves, but they thought it was just states' rights, right? Only 38% of people thought it was about slavery, and only 9% of people thought it was about both, and 6 people just did not know. Like, that's staggering that we live in a country where that many people could be misinformed and misunderstand the whole issue, which was the bloodiest conflict in the United States of America. I don't understand how, I do understand, but it really baffles me that this has gone unaddressed for so long. It is really like you kind of hit the nail on the head there. It's like, why would you romanticize traitorous losers? You don't go to Germany today and see statues to Adolf Hitler and statues to all his generals in the Third Reich and all this romanticizing. No, if you go there, they try to bury like that never even happened. They go out their way to distance themselves from that terrible past because it was the wrong side of history. The Confederacy was on the wrong side of history. So why are these people holding on so tight to it? These statues, monuments, street names, school names need to go, because if you're of African American descent, when soon as you see a Confederate flag or a Confederate journal, what's the first thing that pops in your mind is slavery. The very first thing. You can't escape that connection because it is the connection. It's the violent connection. It's the violent reason why these places went to war. Even if they listen to Robert E. Lee, was once quoted when asked about putting monuments in the graveyards near Gettysburg. And he said it was best not to keep the sores of war open and follow the examples of nations who obliterated memorials to civil strife. Even the man who they erected monuments for even said it's best not to do that because you're going to cause strife and dissension amongst the people, right? He even knew back then, and yet they still build a monument to him in direct opposition to what he even said, right? It's totally asinine. It's because history has been whitewashed that we don't that certain people know the truth and certain people don't. And it's time for people to kind of just wake up and smell the coffee. I mean, it's totally unacceptable to have these odes and tributes to people who fought to keep another group of people enslaved. It's totally one of the most morally irreprehensible things you can align yourself with. So when people try to say they proudly wave that rebel flag, either they don't know what they're doing, saying, or they do know what they're saying, which makes it even worse. And it's time that these statues and monuments need to go. And thankfully, you see some governments and politicians, local government politicians, moving to have them removed. But a lot of them, you see that they're not trying to do that. They're trying to protect them and keep them up. You just heard Trump is activating the U.S. Marshal Service and is going to stand them up to literally guard these Confederate monuments and statues. He's actually mobilizing the National Guard to guard these racist odes to the past. And we have to say in ourselves, if you're going down the street and you're romanticizing slave owners, you're romanticizing people who fought for the people in enslavement. What does that say about you as a country? What does that say about you as the fabric of your nation? That you have these monuments and testaments to these evil men, and there's no way you can legitimately justify that. There's no way you can try to shade that in a different light. Like you said, Troy, monuments are not for preserving history. Monuments are for glorifying someone. You glorify someone with a monument. That's why Hitler doesn't have a monument, because he doesn't need to be glorified. Why should these people, right? If you want to keep history and preserve history, go to museum, learn about it in a textbook. There's plenty of things that we know historically that do not have a monument to it. This should be one of
them. A quick point of order. While Germany does their best to not acknowledge what happened, the students still know and understand the history of what happened in World War I and World War II. They don't need statues of Adolf Hitler, nor do they need Nazi flags around every corner in order to know their history. That history is not lost whatsoever to the world, nor to Germany itself. And that's the same would be true of the Confederacy. I've seen people tearing down these statues. I think some of it might have gone a touch too far, as some people are ripping down statues of the founding fathers and people who are unrelated to the Confederacy. I think that's a separate argument and a separate issue. The issue, for me personally, it's not just a matter of the fact that, because I've seen the argument that, George Washington owned slaves and what have you. At some point, every state in America had slaves in it, all of them. But one by one, states decided to give up this horrible institution. And some states decided that they'd rather die first than give up the institution of slavery. And they decided that the white man should always be superior to the Negro race. That is not a cause worth having a statue. While Washington has a statue because he founded the very nation that we live in, why does Jefferson Davis have one? What did he found? What did he do? What did he win? What makes him notable? Same thing for Robert E. Lee. What did he win? What did he found? It was their desire to split this country in half and literally create a separate nation. It's unworthy of having a statue. They have no accolades or achievements that make them worthy of statuehood or streethood or having an elementary school named after them or a high school, and then even worse, the mascot's the rebels, old running red with the Confederate flag. That's insanity. It's absolute insanity. If some people, I'm sure, just thought it was just about Southern culture and heritage and pride. What you need to understand is do the research, take a look at the history, read the books, read the words of their own mouths of these people, and see what that heritage and pride was about. It was about white supremacy and ensuring slavery moving forward for generations. If I were to hop in a time machine and come before Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, they're going to put me in chains. They're going to put Mike in chains and anybody who looks like us. They're not going to have a conversation with us, no matter how intelligent or what information we have. They see themselves as superior. That was their goal. They would be sad to see a nation today in which black people live equally and in relative harmony with their peers and have peace and make money. They would be disgusted by this nation. This is not what they wanted. They had to be absolutely beaten into surrender. They were willing to fight and die to ensure white supremacy and slavery. As a result, every Confederate monument must come down, every Confederate symbol must end. And at this stage, it's either willful ignorance or intentional hostility. There is no more room left for defense of these monuments. The President of the United States is deploying U.S. Marshals to defend statues of Confederate leaders. They didn't even deploy marshals to defend neighborhoods, stores, police precincts. But the monuments, that's enough. And I'm quite disappointed in the GOP, quite disappointed in the Republicans that fight to defend this nonsense. And there's a small minority of Democrats in those southern states, too, who fight and defend this nonsense. These statues need to come down. They have no historical value. They are nothing more than menacing reminders of white supremacy to the 40 plus million African Americans in this country and anybody who has an understanding of history that looks at them.
When you talk about the founding fathers and some of the first U.S. presidents, I think me personally, and this is me personally, my feelings about it, if their statues were torn down, I wouldn't lose an ounce of sleep over it. And I know that they had a great historical significance to this country, but at the same time, they were slave owners. I mean, you look at Thomas Jefferson, TJ was a terrible person. I mean, he wrote pamphlets and articles arguing that African Americans had no brain, and if they did have a brain, it was very tiny and only capable of following orders and following tasks. He argued that African Americans' their rightful place was to be in bondage and enslaved to the white man. He argued in scientific papers and wrote pamphlets and publications arguing this. And then on top of that, he killed and raped his slaves, right? Now, maybe I feel a different way about it if I go up to the Thomas Jefferson Memorial and I see here is Thomas Jefferson, founding father and rapist. I was like, well, at least they got his narrative correct, right? Because he was also still a terrible person. Just because you do a good thing does not absolve you of your sins. And this man died believing that. Now, you said if those Confederate generals were alive today, if Thomas Jefferson was alive today, he would want you in chains. He'd be appalled to see African Americans and probably almost anybody of any minorities and any type of power running around free, living what he tried to call what we call today the American dream, right? So I'm fine with a lot of these statues and monuments going down, whether it's to Confederate soldiers, Confederate leaders in general, people who push for the Confederacy, or have it be it some of these founding fathers who we have to put in the right historical context, because often we over romanticize them like they were so perfect, like they were so great. A lot of them were also terrible, terrible, terrible people. And I think all that kind of goes hand in hand. We need to reshape who are we honoring and who are we remembering, and at least frame them in the correct historical context. But at the very least, it shouldn't be, to me, it blows my mind there's even up debate that the odes and statues and memorials and streets all dedicated to the Confederacy still stand today. They should be removed. There's no place for them in the United States. If we're supposed to be land of the free, home of the brave, well, why are we celebrating the people who are fighting for bondage? So I think it's just, one of those things we have to really come together and use common sense. I'm really, certain people who are spouting that you're destroying history and it has to stay and all that, they don't surprise me. But then there's certain people that, like you said, there's certain Democrats, Southern Democrats who are fighting for or saying, well, let's go and not tear them down. Let's put them in storage, for a rainy day so they can put it back out there. Some things don't need to be put back out there. Maybe a few of them go to a museum, but other than that, the rest of them need to be destroyed. I don't care if some artist made it back in 1922. Like, who cares, right? So I think that it's time for people to just say, okay, let's try to get this right. Let's not make these monuments to racists and slavers. There's plenty of people in American history that you can make monuments to, both black, white, Latino, Asian. There's so many people throughout that have contributed to this country in a positive manner that you don't have to romanticize, and you don't have to try to whitewash history to make these other evil men reframe them in a positive light. It's time that we kind of get our act together and start making monuments and making naming streets and schools after people who had a positive impact on this world, not people who are looking to destroy it.
I wouldn't lose any sleep either if they all came down, but at least I understand, why, they put them there just literally for their role in the founding of the country. But you know what? In removing a lot of these memorials to heinous people, truly reprehensible individuals, we can make room for people who deserve them, real heroes. While we name our bases after people who fought for Confederacy, what about the many Medal of Honor recipients and what have you, the honorable men that fought and died in World War One and Two? We should be bringing history along, not keeping these people who were reprehensible standing for all time. 10,000 years later, who was Thomas Jefferson again? Why is he? That's one thing, but it's a hard sell to have Jefferson Davis stuck up there. We have to put this history behind us, because the reality is, here's the direct correlation. Teaching history inappropriately and improperly and leaving out the ugly bits, as they say, if you don't learn your history, you'll be doomed to repeat it. We have people fighting for the wrong things, pushing racism, pushing heinous realities, and they think things are better in today's day and age than what they really are, because they have not been taught a proper history. They think everything's sunshine and rainbows, and they have not seen the true horrors that this nation has committed against its own citizens. And the only way to move forward is better education, and better education will promptly get you to understand that those memorials must go by any means necessary.
The nail on the head right there in closing, that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And to be honest, take a look at our nation today. It's really at a fever pitch. There's people who honestly believe another civil war is coming, right? You even have in the news, a recent news article on a slight tangent, they were talking about, they caught these three police officers talking about how they couldn't wait to shoot some black people. They were dying to kill some black people, and they got caught on camera. They didn't realize they were being recorded, and they're up there fantasizing about killing black people and saying they can't wait for this civil war to happen, right? This is not a game. The country is at a boiling point, and you start seeing the mistakes of the past creeping back up in the future because we do not know our history. So it's important that we ask you to kind of spread this message, send it to your black friends, send it to your white friends, send it to your Latino friends, send it to everybody. Everybody needs to hear this, because everybody needs to understand what their history is and why it affects their present. And we just want to, kind of leave you with these words of encouragement. Even though times are rough, we do see rays of light. We do see a lot of, especially younger people who have access to, right, thankfully have access to the internet and can do their own research and start seeing the errors of the past. But we need people to continue to learn, continue to grow their knowledge base, continue to share with each other, whether you just call somebody on the phone like, hey, did you know this, or say something in passing. And the more people you kind of enlighten and wake their eyes up, the more that we can start peeling back this band-aid of hatred and racism that has been plaguing our country for too long. So we just want to thank you again for listening. It's been a pleasure talking to you guys. Thank you for all the love, support. Be sure to like, rate, review, and of course, share. Please share. It helps us out a whole lot. So once again, I'm Mike.
I'm Troy.
And this is Upon Further Review.